everything, all of the rich UIs that we talk about building really are enhancements on the core user experience of just existing on the web. What I mean is that the web is really good at doing what it does a lot of the time, right? The web gives us a lot of tools. HTML gives us a lot of tools for highly interactive experiences, but you need JavaScript to really polish all of that, right? Like JavaScript enables a lot of the interactive feedback that we get from client side applications, especially. But sometimes JavaScript doesn't load for one reason or the other. Maybe your bundle doesn't load. Maybe you have a bad connection. Maybe there's an error thrown somewhere, and it stops everything in your JavaScript bundle from actually loading the
You're listening to episode number 27 of 20Minute JavaScript, where we discuss everything JavaScript related with members from the community. As you know, this whole show is brought to you by OpenReplay, an open source session replay platform for developers. If you'd like to know more, visit openreplay.com. I'm Fernando, your host, and today I'm going to be interviewing Chance Strickland, software developer from the Remix team. We're going to be discussing everything worth knowing about Remix and what makes it so unique. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Chance. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, Fernando, thank you for having me. My name is Chance Strickland. I work on the Remix team. So we'll talk a little bit more, obviously, about what Remix is, but that's my full-time gig. And I live in San Diego, California. I like to surf very poorly, but that's pretty much how I spend my time between those two things.
Awesome. All right, coding and surfing. Nice combo. All right, yeah, and indeed we're going to be talking about Remix. So let's start by a definition. I always like to start by defining it, but I don't want to define it out of the blue. Out of everything you might know from web development and frameworks, not just JavaScript, but PHP, Python, and so on. If you had to choose and compare Remix to one of those, which would be the framework that you would choose to compare it? Which is the most similar one, or several ones if they have like different bits that resemble to what Remix is doing?
Sure, yeah. So I don't think most comparisons are great, and maybe that's something that you see from the inside. You think you've got this special baby that you just
Right.
can't compare to anyone else, and I don't necessarily think of it that way. I just think that if the comparisons made a lot of sense, we wouldn't have had any reason to build
That's
Remix in the
fair.
first place. But if we do need to make comparisons, I think resisting the urge to make comparisons to the other tools in the JavaScript ecosystem, especially just because I think we are a lot closer, more closely related to full stack frameworks in other ecosystems. So think Rails, think Laravel, those sort of things. Um, that's sort of where we're going for. We're going for that full stack experience.
All right, cool. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But what then makes it different from what JavaScript developers are used to? What kind of characteristics are you providing that make it so different that you don't even want to compare it to like Next or anything around it?
Yeah. So to get in here, let's take a step back
All
and
right.
actually just sort of talk about what Remix is, like at its foundation, right? Like it's a framework, but what does that actually mean?
Right.
Uh, Remix it's more than just one thing, right? Remix really is so it's a few different things. So I'll start with the first. To me, is Remix is it's a framework that's driven by routes, right? Remix is built on top of React Router, and the underlying philosophies and technical decisions in React Router drive all of the philosophy and technical decisions in Remix. Remix is also a compiler. Our compiler is using ESBuild under the hood, and I like to think of our compiler and React Router as sort of the two core pillars of Remix that enable everything else that it does. And Remix is a server side first framework, but it's not your server. Right? Remix really is just an HTTP handler that you can run on any JavaScript server of your choosing. You can run, as long as your runtime is powered by JavaScript, you should be able to run a Remix app using just the HTTP handler that it provides. Because of our architecture. Most people are using Node, obviously, but because of our architecture, you can actually use Remix on any JS-driven runtime. So we can run on Dino, we can run on Cloudflare Workers, we can run on Bun. We're pretty much set up to support any spec-driven JS runtime if you're choosing, which I think is really powerful and a big
True.
differentiator for us. Um, and yeah, Remix is a server-side framework, but it's also a client-side framework. We're built on React, right? We don't think of the server first or the client first. We think both are highly important. And so going back to that initial comparison with Rails and Laravel and those sort of things, like they give you tools to work on the front end and the back end, but really Remix gives you tools to bring the front end and the back end closer together, which I think we can dive into a bit
Yeah.
more.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that that's key. What you're saying there, that you're closing that gap between backend and front end. You're providing a way for developers to work that they don't really have to think too much about where they are when they're coding, and that is one of the things that really caught my eye. Like when I was testing Remix and doing some small projects, that I was writing my routes essentially, like you said, it's route based framework, and I was adding code without really thinking, well, is this going to be on the back end, on the front end? How is this going to work? And it just did. That was the best part. I mean, Remix figured it out, and I know that in your documentation, which is, by the way, amazing, super detailed, and
Thank you.
keeps growing. But I know that there are some heavy technical sections of the documentation that cover this. But can you like dumb it down a bit and explain how are you guys achieving that? How are you making that magic essentially? Can you give us a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain?
Yeah, sure. And going back to our compiler, that's really where a lot of that happens, right? Like we're able to use our compiler to basically get a full picture view of your app's routes, and we always start with the routes, right? All of your server and your server logic especially is going to be generally located in your routes. So um, every route exports a few things. You've got your a default export, which is a component. We obviously being a React framework, we allow you to export React components. So your default export from your module, from your route module, is your view. Think of it as your view if you're coming from the MVC world.
Right.
And we also export. You can export a couple of functions. So if you export a loader function, you can think of that as your HTTP GET request handler for that route. If you export an action function, think of that as your HTTP POST request handler for that route. And we can code split all of that out in our compiler, right? We see a loader and we see an action. We pull that out of that module, and that ends up in your server build. It does not end up in your client build, right? And then your client build gets to access that view, right? Which can use data from the loader and the action, but of course, the loader and the action itself is all server side, so that data comes across the wire, right? That that request handler runs on your server. It sends some data in a response, and then your browser code can obviously take that data from that response and deal with it accordingly. But yeah, you've got your views, you've got your actions, and your loaders, which really are kind of your controllers. Again, thinking of it from an MVC perspective. So yeah, but just being able to split those things out of route modules is really a core piece of how that works.
Right. And you touch on it, the whole data loading and so on, because that's part of the bridging that gap. So essentially, me as a developer, I'm writing everything on the same route, backend and front end code. Essentially,
Sure.
I could potentially do it. So I'm thinking about routes. I'm not thinking backend and front end. You guys take that, split it up, actually put it on the backend, actually put it on the front end, but I don't have to make that connection.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about, well, this is my API, and now I have to make a fetch request. I don't know, and get that data. That data comes. That data. I mean, I'm using hooks you provide, and the data is automatic. The whole pipeline is connected by you without me as a developer having to even think about that. That's huge, and that's one of the whole also kind of big aspects of that keeps pulling me towards Remix, the whole data loading aspect of it. I don't want to say the word magic because it's not such a thing, but it's definitely so seamless that it feels like I don't even have to think about it anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we try to actually get a little further away from magic, I would say. Like our goal, I think, is to be a little less magic. Like we've got a compiler obviously and it does some things under the hood, but really what it's doing is just splitting out your code. It's not doing that much else. So we're building you we're giving you a browser build, so a bundle that runs in your browser, and we're giving you a server build. And as far as magic is concerned, we're really just splitting those two things apart from route modules. Everything else is just JavaScript for the most part, and we've got JavaScript that runs on your server and your client. But yeah, you're right. It's that co-location, I think, that really enables a lot of great patterns. I mean, if you imagine when React first came out, it was hugely controversial because it sort of broke down this barrier that we sort of viewed as the mecca as far as patterns are concerned, right? Like the separation of concerns, your views, your models, your controllers, all this stuff was supposed to be in different
True.
places. And then React comes out and it says, no, actually, all of this stateful logic is right there with your view. And a lot of people didn't like that. It was really, it kind of shook the foundations that we thought of as um, I don't know, sort of sacrosanct, but it turned out it really enabled a lot of powerful behaviors with that co-location of logic. And we sort of pushed that boundary a bit further, I think, bringing that co-location even closer together between the server and the client. We're a full stack framework, but really, I think we're a center stack framework. We bring both sides of the stack closer to the center.
I like that. Yeah, I can see it. Now, the other really big feature, if you want to call it that, and I call it that because it's something I haven't seen before on any other framework. I know probably existed somewhere else. Is nested routes. I
Sure.
see it. I see it as a way to like grab a section of your page, a set of components that are grouped together, or even one, and then map it to a route. But can you elaborate a bit on how it works and why do you add it? I mean, what kind of benefits are you expecting people to get from it?
Yeah, nested routes are really a superpower in Remix for sure. And no, we're not the first framework to give you nested routes. We're A lot of tools in the past have had nested routing. This concept of basically a route hierarchy where routes at the top of the hierarchy are also rendered or also used for data for routes lower in the hierarchy, and we're very much the same way. If you've used React Router 6 at all, React Router 6 introduced this concept to the sort of the JavaScript React ecosystem at least. And what's nice about nested routing is you already mentioned with views, for example, when you're thinking of your routes as just a page that you're looking at on a website, right? You've got different components. So think of an invoicing website or an invoicing app on the web, and you're going to have your controls on the side that's going to have links for viewing different invoices, a link for managing your invoices, a link for looking at a specific invoice, a link for your account settings, all of these things, right? But they're all sort of related to the underlying application, the invoicing application, right? So you might have a route at invoices, and that route's going to need to share a lot of your views with the the underlying app at the top, right? It's going to need to share the views with your account settings to a certain degree because you're still going to have the same views on the side. You're going to have you might have similar widgets elsewhere on the screen, but it also shares a lot of data loading, right? Like you still need to load data across your application. You're going to need to load data for the user who's logged into the invoicing system. You're going to need to load data for if you're looking at a specific invoice. You're going to need to load data for that invoice, right? But you also might need to load data about other invoices on various screens, right? So you can do that without nested routes, but it's kind of a pain because you're going to have to either duplicate a lot of code or extract into separate modules, and then import all of that stuff and make sure you're doing it the same place, the same way everywhere. You're going to have to make sure you're working with similar cache headers, that sort of thing. So Yes, you can do that without nested routes, but nesting your routes makes that a lot simpler because we always load data for the routes at the bottom. I'm trying to think. Do we say the bottom of the tree or the top of the tree? What shape is the tree? I don't
Right?
even. We
Yeah.
talk about trees here now, and I'm getting confused. But essentially, if think of your root route as kind of all of that data is loaded across your application. That's sort of your parent route, and then each child routes can load their own data, but it's still going to load the data for that root route. But you can carry that down and build nested routes in that way, such that your child routes are always going to load their own data as well as the data at the top, which makes a lot of sense if you break down web applications like that and you start seeing that a lot of this data is needed across your application. So we make it a lot easier for you to not have to think about sharing that logic because we just load the data in your routes. And then you're able to access that anywhere in that route hierarchy. And we can do that concurrently, so you're not dealing with data waterfalls. We're not If you do that, if you manage all of that stuff just in your components directly, and you're doing that on client side, you're going to end up with a lot of data request waterfalls, and it's going to slow down your application. But when you do it in routes, we're doing all of that concurrently for you. We're handling cancellation, we're handling errors. So we actually do quite a bit on the data side just by enabling nested routing.
Absolutely. And if that data loading fails, if there's a problem with the component, you can also like compartmentalize the damage that error can produce on the whole application by adding boundaries, error
Yeah, the
boundaries.
error boundary components are great. We export two types of boundary components in your routes. You can export an error boundary and a catch boundary, um, which I think are kind of what they sound like. The catch boundary, think of a try catch, right? If you catch an error or if you throw an error from your server, um, you can deal with that. If you throw a response from your server, you can deal with that by catching it in a catch boundary. And just like all of your routes are already nested, the catch and error boundaries work similarly, where that you can think of the boundary as the boundary for that route hierarchy. So you can have different boundaries throughout the routes in your application. So just because you have an error on your server doesn't mean you need to throw a generic error everywhere, right? You can still show parts of the UI uh, higher up in the route hierarchy, and the closest boundary is going to catch that error, right? And then you can handle your
Exactly.
errors a little bit more gracefully, which I think is quite nice. And then your error boundaries are for uncaught errors. Anything that happens that goes wrong and you didn't anticipate it, that's going to end up just sending you down to your error boundary. So those two tools, I think, are also really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Provides a much better user experience in the end for the application if you don't break everything just because something failed. And are we in the realm of what you guys call progressive enhancement, or is that something else that also that's core to Remix somehow?
Totally. Yeah. Great question. The progressive enhancement is a huge part of our story and a huge part of, I think, why we built Remix. It's we think of progressive enhancement as this. Well, I don't, I'll just go back. I don't know that most people do think of progressive enhancement too much. If you use a lot of websites these days, it's not very obvious that it's a prime consideration. So what is progressive enhancement? Progressive enhancement, it means that you should be able to fall back gracefully, right? Everything, all of the rich UIs that we talk about building really are enhancements on the core user experience of just existing on the web. What I mean is that the web is really good at doing what it does a lot of the time, right? The web gives us a lot of tools. HTML gives us a lot of tools for highly interactive experiences, but you need JavaScript to really polish all of that, right? Like JavaScript enables a lot of the interactive feedback that we get from client side applications, especially. But sometimes JavaScript doesn't load for one reason or the other. Maybe your bundle doesn't load. Maybe you have a bad connection. Maybe there's an error thrown somewhere, and it stops everything in your JavaScript bundle from actually working. But does that mean your app has to stop working? Well, in some cases, maybe some pieces of your app stop working because JavaScript is hugely critical to some types of experiences. But HTML is really good in its own of handling a lot of that stuff. So take forms for example. If you're building a form in a React app, chances are that you're just completely bypassing the browser's behavior and dealing with that form submission right there in your component logic. Not every form works this way, but I've worked on a lot of React apps over the years, and most of the forms that I've worked on in that time have sort of worked in that way. And you use some external service to call a submit handler. But the problem with that is that if the bundle doesn't load, if your JavaScript doesn't load, or if it fails for whatever reason, it's sort of like a dead end, right? And the user doesn't get any sort of feedback from that. They just click a button and nothing happens, and you're like,
True.
"What the heck? What's happening with this form? Is anything happening? Is it doing anything? Is it not doing anything? Is there an error? Do I just keep trying? Like, what do I do?" Right? Very confusing. But if you just let the browser do what the browser does, what does the browser do? Well, it sees an action in that form, ideally, and it is going to navigate to that action. It's going to try and make a request, and post or get request to that endpoint, and then it's going to hit that server and try and manage that request on the server, right? And if you write your code in a way that anticipates that, which Remix enables, I think, very nicely, uh, even if your JavaScript fails for one reason or the other, that form is still going to be submitted. The user is still going to get some feedback because the browser is automatically going to reload the page and it's going to reroute you to that action. So you still get a functioning experience there, even if it's not enhanced the way that we would like with all of our fancy client-side JavaScript. So that's how I think of progressive enhancement and the tools that Remix gives you to make that really, really simple. In other frameworks, I think progressive enhancement is often difficult because your all of that logic, all of the front end logic still needs to be in JavaScript, right? Like we still need
Right.
to write that in JavaScript to give you those experiences because JavaScript is the only, it's the only language that is going to allow you to handle interactions on the web. But all of your server logic, all of your controllers and your views and all that stuff is in PHP or Ruby or whatever. So you kind of have to separate that by the nature of the tooling. But Remix allows you to write it all in the same place, which I think is quite nice.
Yeah, and I think that it works because going back to what we're talking about data loading and route-based components, and you're writing everything together, and then the compiler and everything, then you're deciding what to load, when to load, and how to serve it to the client, and that's, I think, fantastic. Because you don't really have to think about progressive enhancement. You just have to use the tools that you're given and it just works. Is this also sort of related to, and I don't know if actually Remix is doing it, but I'm assuming, is there like a server side rendering component to how you serve the pages that allows it to, in the case of a form, load the form, and if there, with everything it needs to without having to worry about JavaScript, if it loads, great, and if it doesn't, it just works anyway? Or how are you serving that, or how are you taking that into
Well,
consideration?
yeah, our form abstraction, like we give you a form component, right? If you've
Right.
used React Router before, we have a link component. You import the link, and the reason we give you a link component instead of just writing an anchor tag is because the anchor tag is going to reload the page, right? And if you're building a React application, oftentimes you want that single page application style of navigation, right? You don't want to navigate away and reload the whole page. You want to do page transitions. You want to load data very seamlessly without changing the entire view. But a form and a link are actually pretty similar elements. Like you just think of HTML in general, like a link is what is a link doing? It's making a GET request, right? It's making a GET request to a specific endpoint, which is your form's action, right? So if you just write a form with a button in it that has an action somewhere and it's making a GET request, it's going to navigate you to that view. That's what a link does. So they're very similar. And the difference really is that most of your forms are going to also have a request handling element, right? You're not just making a GET request most of the time. And what are you actually doing with that GET request? Are you just navigating, or are you loading some data? Like a form is also generally going to be doing something with your data. And so the it makes sense that Remix is not only going to give you that link, it's going to give you a form. And we give you a form component, and you asked what we do to I guess make that easier. Really, we don't do much because it's just HTML. It's an enhancement on HTML, but it's just HTML in the sense that you make a GET request or a POST request via your form. You've got some fields that send some data, and then you post to an action. And that action, that route, is where all of that logic is handled. It just so happens that that logic is handled generally or oftentimes in the same location as where you author the form, which is very different from other frameworks, right? You can have an action post to the same form and handle all of that, the view, the client side experience, the server side experience, and then actually handle that request and send a response all from the same route, which I think is super, super cool. It goes back to the co-location that we talked about before, and it makes all of these other things like progressive enhancement, optimistic updates much simpler because they're all right there, and you're not dancing around between different modules, different languages, and that sort of
Right.
thing.
Right. And is this set of tools, this like form component that you provide, the link component that you provide, that are delivered to the client? And kind of this was where my question was going. They are delivered to the client in you as a developer use it as a link. You use it as the remix form, but they are delivered to the client as pure HTML form, a pure HTML anchor, with the
Yes,
extra choose needed to work as you would expect it if there is JavaScript, or just work as the browser needs it to work if there is no JavaScript. That's also the key. Yeah.
that's right. And if there's no JavaScript, or if the JavaScript just hasn't loaded yet, which is often the case if you're on a slow connection, right? You get your HTML first, then it has to parse the JavaScript and all that, and then it has to execute it. Well, that doesn't happen very fast for everyone, and so sometimes it's helpful to be able to make that interactive a lot more quickly than your JavaScript loading, right? We want your time to interactive to be as low as possible. So if I'm if because the user doesn't see JavaScript, right? They don't see your JavaScript has loaded unless they've got the network tab open. And who browses the web like that? Nobody does. So, they're going to see a form pop up on the page and they're going to start filling out the form, right? And if all of your logic's on the client and all of that stuff happens in JavaScript land, it's not going to work, right? It's going to post to an action maybe, but then it's just going to really reload the page and they're not going to get any good
Right.
feedback. So you've not really helped them out any. In fact, it's just made it more confusing. But if everything works without having to deal with all of that, or if it's at least functional and gives you some feedback, that's going to be a much better user
Yeah,
experience.
absolutely. It's probably one of the top characteristics of Remix that I highly encourage people to read about and understand, because it allows you to create, like, we're talking about much better, considerably much better user experience with very little effort on your side. Absolutely. All right, moving on, because I want to talk about stacks, because I not sure I understand them. I went through the pages when you guys originally released the concept of remix stacks, and at the beginning I thought it was like well, this is like a cloud-based offering. The company Remix is offering everyone so they can just deploy with minimum effort. But then rereading it again, are we talking about like templates for projects, or like pre-made recipes that I can just like, I don't know, I want to build a blog with Remix. I run a command and it'll give me literally everything, every tool I need to build it, even if I want to deploy locally or on my own machine? Or what are Remix stacks exactly?
Yeah. So just to start, we are not offering you a cloud offering. There's
All
no
right,
Remix cloud
cool.
offering. Yeah, we're not in the cloud business. So um, I understand what people think that it's like the natural. It seems like the natural move for every framework
Yeah,
these days
exactly.
is to get you on their cloud service. That's not our mo. We actually quite the opposite. We want to make it really easy to deploy your app anywhere. So I think by the nature of what we're building, it would be weird for us to have a cloud. It would be, yeah, there'd be some conflict of interest there, I think. So I don't think we're going to get in the cloud business. I don't know. I don't run
Right,
the
right.
business, so don't quote me on that. But I don't think we will. It's not really our plan. But what are stacks? It's a great question. You said recipes, and I think it's a great way to think about it. Um, we're a full stack framework, but even a full stack framework is not going to want to make every single decision about every single tool that your app uses, right? We want to give you a lot of really powerful tools, but there's so much involved in building a web application. You've got authentication, you've got databases, you've got your ORM for your databases, you've got tests, right? Like you have all these things that you need to build, and there's a billion tools out there to facilitate that. And we want to help you, but we don't necessarily want to make that
Right.
decision for you. You might want this tool to deviate, and if we lock you in, then that's going to make it really difficult to move forward at a certain point. So, unfortunately, that means even a full stack framework is going to leave a lot of that wiring up to you, right? And that's not great. Like we don't want building a project to take an initial month of just setting up tooling. And so what Remix Stacks really does is yeah, it's a recipe. It's a mixture of all of the different tools, different configurations of different tools that you can use to spin up an app really, really quickly without having to do all the configuration, without having to manage all of the dependencies. Those stacks will give a lot of that stuff to you right out of the box so that when you install it, which you can with our CLI, if you use npx create remix, you'll get an interactive CLI that will ask you, do you want to set up a project from scratch or do you want to use a stack? And we actually give you three of our own stacks that you can choose from that we update and maintain. But you can also create your own stacks if you don't like what we offer. A lot of our stacks come with some tools baked in, and you might not like those. So that's great. You can create your own stack, and right there in our CLI, you can just say this stack is hosted at this GitHub repo, and it will start your project from that repo. Right. So it's really, yeah, it's a starter recipe for a new application that comes pre-built with a bunch of tooling so that getting up and running is really simple.
Nice. All right. It's like, yeah, the Create Remix app, but on steroids. All right. Last question about Remix. We're still on 1.x right now. And I know you don't run the business. And I know that maybe there's a roadmap that you can potentially share with us. But thinking of 2.0, which probably is ways ahead in the future, what would you like to see on Remix 2.0? What are the features that you're most excited about coming or adding from other places?
Totally. Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest things is not so much a feature as it is an enhancement of our existing tooling. And um, specifically with our compiler, I think our compiler can do a lot more and will do a lot more. So think in terms of styling. Think of bringing in different types of styling. Like right now, we sort of, I think, intentionally take a step back from when we talk about styling, we take a step back from what a lot of the React ecosystem has done. You talked about magic earlier, and I had mentioned that we try and reduce the
Hmm.
magic. Um, a lot of magic happens in styling. You think about styled components and that sort of thing. How does that actually get to your CSS? How do those styled components actually get onto
True.
your page? How are they loaded? People actually think about that. We want to make it very intentional. We want to make people understand where that happens because it happens by importing a style sheet, right? Um, but a lot of other frameworks don't really do it that way. They'll inject it into your page. You're not able to cache that content effectively. So we want to make that very intentional. But that also means that you're a little bit more limited as far as how you can use some of these styling tools in the JavaScript ecosystem. And we want to find a way to bridge that, right, and bring that back. We still want to make it intentional, but we want to make you think about where those styles end up on the page, but we still want to enable a lot of that tooling. And I think our compiler will be enhanced to enable a lot more tooling in a 2.0. Another thing that we're looking at very seriously, and this isn't even really a 2.0 thing as much as a thing that I think people could do now if they wanted to, if they had enough grit and time. And but we really want to be able to support uh, any framework, not just React. So we give you a package, a Remix Run React package that, like I said, is built on top of React Router. But we've been working on a new router package that is it's a framework agnostic router that gives you a lot of the same logic that you get from a React router, but then you can use it to build a router in any framework. And so you'll see people building Remix apps on top of Vue, on top of Svelte. There's already a few proof of concepts floating around out there where people have already done this, which I think is really exciting. So we're looking to bring first class attention to that in a 2.0 and start really seriously looking at how to Remix offer first class support for other frameworks, which I think is really exciting.
That's interesting.
And
Yeah.
then I would say, yeah, no, it's super cool. And yeah, I mean, we love React. I love React. I've been working in React for a long time, but it's exciting to be able to give people similar tools in other JavaScript ecosystems as well.
Amazing. I was going to ask you initially if there were any plans to, move away from React, but considering how built in the React router is, I thought it was going to be a definite no. So that's so interesting that you guys are working on something that is completely agnostic and able to work with anything. Okay, so 2.0 looks, much interesting even now. So cool. All right, that's it for our topic. But I still have three more questions I ask every guest.
Okay,
All
go
right,
for it.
so you're supposed to be prepared for this. I hope you are.
We'll see.
So the first one
I just
is,
want to make a note for your listeners. It's
yeah,
like 6:30 in the morning for me. I think you're over in Europe. I'm in California, so like
yeah,
we're very separated. And so I'm like drinking my coffee, trying to wake up still. So don't. I did read these questions. I did sort of prepare, but I'm also very tired. So
yeah,
don't
yeah.
mind me.
I didn't know it was that early. Sorry about that. I'm making you
No,
think
you're
way too
good.
early in the day. Yeah.
I'm used to it.
All right. All right. All right. So first question: what's the best advice you ever received?
There's lots of good ones, but I'm gonna go with, at least in the software domain, I'm gonna
Right.
say just build it and just ship it. Don't don't overthink it. Don't get bogged down in worrying about what other people are gonna think. Just ship stuff. It's gonna it's gonna make all the difference in the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. All right. Probably a dumb question, but what's the most exciting project you worked on?
If I didn't say remix, I think I'd get fired. So I
Right.
gotta say, no, I'm kidding. I really do. I think remix is extremely exciting. I think it's kind of revolutionary in a way, and it's a really awesome product to be a part of. A really great team and a really great community around it. I'm stoked that I get to work on it, and I love talking about it. It's fun, it's exciting, and I think it's going to change the way we think about apps. Not even amongst just Remix users. I think Remix is going to influence how other tools and ecosystems think about building their applications, and we've already seen that influence sort of come to fruition in other tools. So, I think it's huge and super exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And finally, what is one thing you wish you knew when you started coding that you eventually picked up over the years?
One thing that's, I think the toughest thing is picking just one.
Right.
It's so many things, but for me, I think it goes back to the first answer, which is I wish someone would have told me that I didn't have to spend 9 years trying to get something absolutely perfect on the first try, and which is exactly what I did early in my career.
Okay.
I'd say, yeah, just get comfortable shipping, putting yourself out there, working in public. Um, those are all really valuable ways to move forward. They're super terrifying and scary, especially if you spend a lot of time around people with a lot more experience than you. But it's really the only way to push yourself forward.
I agree. I agree. Yeah. You end up making a lot of mistakes, but also learning a lot from them. So yeah, I agree with that.
And also on a similar vein, I'll just add one thing on that. On a
Yeah,
similar
yeah.
vein, backing up from just shipping and building, I'd say just in general, maybe this is good life advice beyond just software, but it definitely applies to software. It's just do things that scare you, do things that make you uncomfortable. If you stay comfortable, if you stay in that nice bubble, like, yeah, it feels safer, um, but it's going to keep you from really excelling in a way that I think is going to push you forward in not just in your career, but in all aspects of your life. So um, try and step out of that space sometime and just do more things that scare you a bit.
Yep. I agree. Can say I disagree with that one. It's definitely top advice when it comes to growing personally, professionally, and in every other aspect as well. So we're definitely on the same page there. All right, now we're done. That's it. Thank you, Chance. It was super interesting. I am falling even more in love with Remix after this episode. So I hope I get to use it more often. And I can't wait to see what 2.0 actually brings on the table. So before you leave, can you please tell our audience where they can find you if they want to know more about Remix or anything else?
Yes. Yeah, remix.run is our website. Remix_run is on Twitter. You can find me at Chance the Dev on Twitter, all one word. You can also find me at a little website I'm working on called fronttoback.dev, which is going to be a course targeted at front end developers that I'm building. It's a course for front end developers who want to get deep on the back end.
All
So
right.
people, honestly, people like myself before I started working on Remix, people who've been in the front end for a while, but then they look at a request handler and they go, "What the heck do I do with
Right.
this thing?" So, how do I run a database? How do I build authentication into my app? Like, I think these are hugely important questions, and um, it's going to make you not only stronger on as a full stack developer, but it's actually going to make you a better front end developer in surprising ways. So yeah, fronttoback.dev is a spot for that sort of thing if you're interested. But otherwise, yeah, catch me on Twitter. I tweet a bunch of nonsense and occasionally talk about tech.
All right. We'll add all those links on the show notes so people can really just click and get to you. And that's it. Now we're definitely done. Again, thank you, Chance, for for coming in, and to everyone listening. Thank you for listening. Catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks, Fernando, for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.